I can't believe you would do this today of all days.
Please, not here.
Everyone's watching.
I realized something was wrong before anyone raised their voice. It happened in that narrow stretch of time when a wedding hasn't started yet, but it's already too late to change direction. Chairs were set, music was cued. Guests were arriving with that polite excitement people bring when they expect everything to unfold smoothly. Stella Walker stood near the side of the ceremony space, hands folded in front of her, listening. From a distance, it looked like a quiet conversation, a necessary one. The kind people assume is normal, right before a ceremony. Joyce Walker stood directly in front of her, not beside her, not angled, directly in front, close enough that Stella couldn't step away without making it obvious. I've planned enough weddings to know when proximity isn't accidental. Joyce wasn't comforting, she was positioning herself. Her body language said this was still her territory. Even now, Austin was nearby, distracted, pulled into a last-minute conversation with a groomsman. He hadn't noticed yet. Or maybe he had, and chose not to interrupt. I've seen both versions before. Earlier that morning, Joyce had been everywhere. She asked about timing, then corrected it. Asked about seating, then changed it. Asked about logistics, then reminded everyone casually how much she had contributed to make this day possible. It was never said aggressively. It didn't need to be. Money rarely does when it's already understood as leverage. Stella had handled it with restraint. She thanked Joyce, she nodded. She redirected questions back to me when she could. She tried, gently, to maintain a sense of authorship over her own wedding. Joyce allowed it. At first, that's an important detail. Control doesn't start by taking everything. It starts by letting you believe you still have something. By the time we were minutes from lining up for the ceremony, the dynamic had shifted. Joyce wasn't asking anymore. She was informing. She spoke with the confidence of someone who believed permission had already been granted by virtue of her last name, her checkbook, and her role as Austin's mother. I noticed Stella's posture change while Joyce spoke. Her shoulders tightened. Her eyes fixed on a point just past Joyce's face, like she was grounding herself, preparing. Something had been said. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I've learned to watch faces instead. Stella's expression wasn't panic. It wasn't sadness. It was calculation. That look someone gets when they realize the line they thought existed might only exist for them. Joyce leaned in slightly, lowering her voice, confident the moment belonged to her. Stella didn't step back. She didn't agree either. That was the first moment of resistance. Small, quiet, almost invisible to everyone else. But I saw it. And I knew then that whatever Joyce expected to happen next, Stella was no longer willing to play along. With the ceremony moments away, the space for negotiation was gone. What remained was a boundary waiting to be tested. Joyce Walker chose her moment carefully. It happened just after Stella finished adjusting her dress, when the room briefly cleared and the noise softened into distant movement and muffled voices. That quiet never lasts long before a ceremony, and Joyce knew it. She stepped forward as if she'd been waiting for that exact pocket of silence. She reached for the fabric at Stella's waist, not to fix anything, but to assert proximity. Stella stiffened immediately. Not dramatically, just enough that I noticed the contact wasn't welcome. "You need to listen to me for a second," Joyce said, her tone calm, rehearsed, almost parental. "This is important." Stella looked down at Joyce's hand, then back up. She gently moved a half step away, creating space without saying anything. That was the boundary. Clear, physical, polite. Joyce smiled as if nothing had happened. "I spoke with the officiant," she continued. "We're adjusting the wording during the ceremony." Stella blinked. "What wording?" Joyce waved her hand dismissively. "The personal part. The part you added. It's not appropriate. We're keeping it traditional." Stella shook her head immediately. There was no hesitation this time. "No," she said. "That stays." The word landed heavier than Joyce expected. I could tell by the way Joyce's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second before returning, tighter this time. "You're nervous," Joyce replied. "This is exactly why I've been handling things." Stella took a slow breath. She kept her voice even. "We already agreed on this." Austin agreed. I agreed. "It's not changing." Joyce leaned closer, lowering her voice as if the quiet made her authority stronger. "Austin doesn't need to be stressed with details right now. This is about protecting him and the family." There it was. The shift. From suggestion to justification, Stella crossed her arms, grounding herself. "This is my ceremony too," she said. "I'm not comfortable changing it." Joyce's expression hardened, not angry yet, controlled, assessing. "I paid for this officiant," she said. "I paid for this venue. I am not letting you turn this into something embarrassing." The hallway felt suddenly smaller. Stella glanced briefly toward the doorway, maybe hoping Austin would appear, maybe just checking that someone else existed outside this moment. Joyce noticed. "Don't make this difficult," she said. "We're minutes away, just let it go." That was the test. Not shouted, not dramatic. A quiet demand for compliance, wrapped in timing and money and family obligation. Stella straightened her spine. Her voice was steady when she answered. "I'm not letting it go." For a moment, Joyce simply stared at her, as if genuinely surprised that resistance had continued past one exchange, as if she believed the first refusal was an anomaly, not a decision. Her jaw tightened. Her fingers curled slightly. Behind us, the ceremony music was being cued. Guests were taking their seats. The window to force agreement was closing fast. Joyce stepped closer again, reclaiming the space Stella had created. And I knew then that Joyce wasn't testing a boundary anymore. She was deciding whether to crush it. Joyce Walker's patience didn't snap all at once. It thinned carefully, strategically. She shifted her tone first, smoothing it out, lowering it further, as if volume itself were a courtesy she could withdraw. She stepped just to the side of Stella now, close enough that her shoulder brushed the air beside her arm. It was a subtle repositioning, but deliberate. It turned the moment from confrontation into containment. "This isn't about you," Joyce said quietly. "This is about Austin." Stella didn't respond right away. She stared straight ahead, jaw set, breathing, measured. I could see her doing the internal math: how much energy to spend, how much to conserve, how close they were to walking down the aisle. Joyce took the silence as permission. "You don't understand what this dame means to him," she continued. "Or what people expect. You're coming into a family with a reputation. We don't air personal things in public." Stella turned to face her fully now. "They're my words," she said. "About my life. I'm not removing them." Joyce exhaled sharply through her nose, a sound that wasn't quite a sigh. "You're being stubborn," she replied. "And right now, stubborn looks ungrateful." That word hung in the air between them, ungrateful. Joyce straightened her posture, reclaiming the authority she felt slipping. "Do you know how many calls I made for this wedding?" she said. "How many checks I signed, how many favors I pulled." Stella didn't look impressed. She looked tired. "I didn't ask for that," she said. "And it doesn't give you the right to change things without telling me." That was when Joyce's control tactics escalated from words to pressure. She stepped past Stella slightly, angling her body toward the doorway where the bridesmaids were gathering, where anyone could walk in at any moment. "You're causing a problem," Joyce said, just loud enough now that it wasn't entirely private. "Everyone is ready. Don't be the reason we're delayed." Stella's eyes flicked toward the doorway. She lowered her voice instinctively, trying to keep the moment contained. "Please stop," she said. "This is not the time." Joyce smiled. It wasn't warm. It was the kind of smile meant to signal reasonableness to anyone watching. "I'm being calm," Joyce replied. "You're the one escalating this." That's a tactic I've seen many times. Frame resistance as instability. Frame control as composure. Austin's name came up next. "I spoke to my son," Joyce said. "He understands." Stella's head snapped up. You did not, she said immediately. Joyce tilted her head. He doesn't need to be in the middle of this. I'm protecting him from unnecessary stress. Stella shook her head, disbelief breaking through her restraint. You don't get to decide that. The air felt heavier now. The music outside shifted as guests settled. The ceremony was minutes away, maybe less. Joyce's voice dropped again. You are about to walk into our family, she said. And this is not how we start. Stella swallowed hard. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but her voice didn't. Then maybe this family needs to learn where my line is. For a split second, Joyce looked almost stunned. Then her face changed. The composure cracked just enough to reveal something sharper underneath. Something that had been held in check by timing and optics, and was now running out of room. Joyce took one more step forward, close enough now that Stella had to lean back slightly. And I felt it then. That unmistakable shift when a private power struggle is about to spill into something far more visible. Whatever Joyce had been holding back was about to come out. The moment spilled into public space before anyone had time to stop it. A door opened behind Joyce. One of the bridesmaids stepped halfway into the hallway, then froze, sensing something was wrong, but not understanding it yet. The quiet pocket Joyce had chosen collapsed instantly. Sound rushed back in footsteps. Voices. The low hum of guests settling into their seats just beyond the walls. Joyce didn't step back. She didn't lower her voice either. If you embarrass us out there, she said, now clearly audible, don't expect my support afterward. Stella's eyes widened, not with fear, but with disbelief. You're threatening me, she said. It wasn't a question. Joyce scoffed. I'm warning you. I moved instinctively, taking one step closer. Not to intervene, yet intervention too early can make things worse, but to be present, to be seen. Stella's voice shook for the first time. Not loud, not dramatic. Just enough to betray how much she was holding together. Please stop, she said. This ends now. That should have been the end of it. Joyce laughed. It was sharp, short, and it carried just far enough for others to hear. Don't tell me what ends, she replied. Stella turned her head slightly, maybe looking for Austin, maybe looking for anyone who could anchor her back to reality. That movement, small, defensive, seemed to be the final trigger. Joyce's hand moved before her expression did. It wasn't a wild swing. It wasn't theatrical. It was quick, flat, and unmistakable. The sound cut through the hallway. Stella stumbled back half a step, more from shock than force. Her hand flew to her face. The room went completely still in that unnatural way only real incidents create. Conversations outside faltered. Someone gasped. I saw the bridesmaid's face drain of color. Joyce stood there, breathing hard, eyes locked on Stella, as if daring anyone to reframe what had just happened. For a split second, no one moved, not because they agreed, because no one knew what to do with what they had just witnessed. Then voices rushed in. Someone said Joyce's name. Someone else said Stella's. The officiant appeared at the doorway, confusion written across his face. A guest whispered loudly enough for others to hear. Did she just? Stella lowered her hand slowly. Her cheek was red. Her expression wasn't crying. It wasn't screaming. It was empty. Austin pushed through the small crowd moments later, his face registering confusion, then horror, then something closer to panic as eyes turned toward him, silently demanding a response. Joyce opened her mouth, already preparing an explanation. I could see it forming the justification, the minimization, the story she would tell to preserve control. But she was too late. The damage wasn't private anymore. It had witnesses. And once something like that happens in front of other people, it no longer belongs to the person who caused it. It belongs to the room. The ceremony music stopped. Guests began to stand. And whatever version of this wedding Joyce thought she was controlling no longer existed. I've seen panic before at weddings. I've seen tears, shouting, people storming out of rooms. What happened after Joyce slapped Stella was different. It was quieter, the kind of quiet that spreads because no one knows which sound would be inappropriate to make next. Stella didn't cry. That's the part that stayed with me. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cover her face and collapse into someone else's arms. She stood there, perfectly still, her hand still hovering near her cheek, as if she hadn't decided yet what to do with it. Her eyes weren't on Joyce anymore. They were somewhere else entirely. Austin reached her first. He didn't say anything at first either. He looked at her face, then at his mother, then back at Stella, like his mind was trying to reorder reality into something that made sense. "What happened?" he asked finally. No one answered immediately. Joyce did take a step forward then, as if proximity could undo what had just occurred. "She was hysterical," she said quickly. "I was trying to calm her down." The word hysterical landed badly in the room. I saw it in the way people shifted their weight, in the way one of the bridesmaids crossed her arms, instinctively defensive. Stella lowered her hand. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her face slightly, not toward Joyce, but toward Austin, so he could see the mark clearly. She still didn't speak. She didn't need to. Austin's face changed when he saw it. Not anger at first. Confusion gave way to something heavier, something like shame. Guests had begun to gather closer, without realizing they were doing it, not crowding exactly, but leaning in, watching. This was no longer a private family moment. It was a social event unfolding in real time. The officiant cleared his throat awkwardly. "Should we pause?" he asked, already knowing the answer. No one told the guests to sit back down. No one restarted the music. Joyce kept talking. "She's under a lot of pressure," Joyce continued. "This is what happens when people can't handle responsibility." Stella flinched at that, just slightly. Not from the words themselves, but from the audacity of saying them out loud, now, in front of everyone. That was when Stella finally spoke. Her voice was calm. Too calm for the moment. "I'm not walking down that aisle," she said. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was final. The sentence moved through the room like a current. You could feel people processing it in real time. Someone gasped quietly. Someone else whispered Austin's name. Austin turned fully toward her. "Stella," he said, his voice cracking. "Let's just take a minute." She shook her head. "No," she said. "This is the minute." She looked past him then, scanning the room, taking in the faces, the witnesses. The reality of where she was and what had happened to her in that space. "I'm not starting a marriage like this," she said. "And I'm not pretending this didn't happen." Joyce's composure finally fractured. "This is unbelievable," she snapped. "After everything I've done for you," Stella turned toward her then, fully, for the first time since the slap. "You don't get to touch me," she said, "and you don't get to decide what happens next." No one interrupted her. That silence was different from the first one. This one wasn't confusion, it was alignment. Austin looked between them again. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see him realizing, too late, that neutrality wasn't an option anymore. That silence itself had become a choice. Stella waited. When he didn't speak fast enough, she nodded once, as if confirming something internally. "I need space," she said, "from all of this." She turned and walked away from the ceremony area. Not running, not collapsing, just walking. Her back straight, her dress brushing softly against the floor. One of the bridesmaids followed her without asking. The guests stayed where they were. No one stopped her. Joyce stood frozen, surrounded by people but suddenly very alone. Her version of the story had nowhere left to land. Too many eyes, too many witnesses. I've learned that real consequences at weddings don't always look like shouting or chaos. Sometimes they look like this. A room full of people silently revising their understanding of a family. A mother realizing that control, once exposed, doesn't inspire loyalty. And a bride choosing not to absorb the damage just to keep the schedule intact. The ceremony never resumed. But the moment Joyce lost control stayed with everyone who saw it, long after the chairs were folded. Long after the guests went home, and long after the idea that this was just wedding stress stopped being believable. I stayed where I was after Stella walked away. That's part of my job too, not just managing timelines, but reading rooms after something irreversible happens. Watching how people rearrange themselves when the story they thought they were attending quietly collapses. Have you ever noticed how quickly a crowd decides what it believes without anyone saying it out loud? The guests didn't rush after Stella. They didn't surround Joyce either. They hovered in that uncomfortable middle ground, pretending to check phones, whispering in half sentences, exchanging looks that carried more meaning than words ever could. Joyce stood near the ceremony entrance, arms crossed now, her earlier certainty draining by the second. She kept looking around as if someone might step in and fix this for her, as if authority, once asserted loudly enough, should automatically restore order. But no one did. Austin lingered where Stella had left him. He hadn't followed her yet. That hesitation mattered. People saw it. I saw it. What would you have done in his place? Would you have gone after your partner immediately, knowing what that choice would signal to everyone watching? Or would you have stayed frozen, hoping time might soften what had just been exposed? Austin rubbed his hands together, pacing a few steps back and forth. He tried to speak to Joyce once. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her shake her head sharply, already framing herself as the injured party. I didn't mean it like that, she said loudly enough for others to hear. She pushed me. That sentence landed poorly, not because it was shocking, but because it was familiar. Too familiar. I've heard versions of it at weddings before, usually after someone crosses a line they never expected to be held accountable for. A few guests exchanged glances. One older woman frowned openly. Another guest leaned toward her companion and whispered something I didn't catch, but the tone was unmistakable. Judgment had entered the room, and judgment, once it does, doesn't leave quietly. The officiant approached me then, his voice low. "What do you want to do?" he asked, as if there were still options that led back to normal. I looked around. At the untouched aisle, at the guests who hadn't been told to sit back down, at the mother who had lost the room without realizing it yet. "What would you do?" I asked him quietly. "If this were your family." He didn't answer. That was answer enough. Austin finally moved. Not toward Joyce, toward the corridor Stella had disappeared into. The shift was subtle, but everyone felt it. Joyce noticed too. Her posture straightened, then stiffened. She called his name once. He didn't turn around. Have you ever seen control fail in real time? Not with yelling, not with confrontation, just with silence. Minutes passed. Long ones. The kind that stretch when no one knows whether to leave or stay. A wedding is supposed to pull people forward, toward a shared moment. This one held them suspended instead. Some guests started to leave quietly. No announcement, no instruction, just a collective understanding that the day, as planned, was over. Joyce remained where she was. She spoke to anyone who would listen, explaining, revising, softening the story around the edges. But stories don't work the same way once there are witnesses. People nodded politely. No one agreed out loud. I thought about how many times she had referenced money, that morning contributions, payments, effort, control framed as generosity. And I wondered how many people in that room were replaying those comments now through a very different lens. By the time Austin returned, alone, the space had thinned considerably. His face was red, his eyes avoided Joyce's. "We're postponing," he said, not looking at her, not asking, telling. Joyce stared at him. "You can't do that," she said. "People are here." He finally met her eyes. They saw what happened. That was the end of the argument. Not because Joyce agreed, because there was nothing left to leverage. The ceremony never resumed. The reception was canceled quietly, with staff doing their best to contain confusion and redirect conversations. People left with stories they would tell carefully at first, then more freely as time passed. I've planned weddings that ended in tears. I've planned weddings that ended in shouting matches. But this one ended in something far more lasting, a collective memory, and those are harder to undo. I often think about Stella after that day, about the choice she made in front of a room full of people, about the moment she decided that absorbing harm was not the price of keeping appearances. And I think about Joyce too. How many times do you think she replayed that moment later, trying to find the exact second where she lost control? Or do you think she still believes she was right? If you were watching that ceremony as a guest, whose side would you have quietly taken and why? What most people never see is what happens after the guests leave. Not the dramatic part, not the moment everyone talks about, but the quieter hours that follow. When the adrenaline fades and people are left alone with the consequences they can't spin anymore. I stayed longer than usual that day. Partly because vendors needed direction, refunds needed discussion, logistics needed untangling. But mostly because I've learned that when a wedding collapses like that, the real story isn't finished when the room empties. It's only just begun. The hallway where Stella had disappeared earlier was quiet now, empty. The kind of quiet that feels heavier than noise. One of the bridesmaids returned briefly to collect Stella's bag. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady when she thanked me. That steadiness told me more than tears would have. Austin never came back to the main space again. He stayed somewhere out of sight, dealing with something that couldn't be handled publicly. I didn't intrude. I rarely do. There are moments when being a professional means knowing when not to ask questions. Joyce, however, remained visible. She paced, she made phone calls. She spoke in fragments, her voice tight, defensive, already constructing a version of events she could live with. She talked about stress, about pressure, about how emotional the day had become. Have you ever noticed how some people explain harm as if it simply appeared without anyone causing it? At one point, she approached me. "I assume this will all be reflected appropriately in the final billing," she said. Her tone was clipped now, transactional, as if money could still reorganize the outcome. I looked at her for a moment before responding. I wasn't angry. I wasn't confrontational. I was tired. "We'll document what happened," I said, accurately. That word accurately made her pause. She didn't argue. She turned away instead. And that told me everything. Because when control finally fails, it often retreats into avoidance. The staff began clearing chairs, folding linens, undoing the careful symmetry we'd spent days building. There's something surreal about dismantling a wedding that never happened. It feels like erasing evidence of an alternate timeline. I've always wondered what goes through a person's mind in moments like that. Do they replay the instant before everything broke, convinced they could still rewind it? Or do they skip ahead, already rewriting the story so they don't have to sit with what they did? Austin and Stella didn't leave together that day. That detail matters. He left first, quietly, without ceremony, without speaking to his mother. Stella left later, through a different exit, accompanied by people who didn't ask her to explain herself. That separation spoke louder than anything said earlier. In my experience, families rarely recover from public moments like that without permanent shifts. Something fundamental changes when a pattern that was once private becomes visible, because once others see it, denial becomes much harder to maintain. I've planned weddings for years, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The way someone behaves when they're losing control tells you far more than the way they behave when everything is going their way. Joyce lost more than a ceremony that day. She lost the room. She lost the narrative. And perhaps most importantly, she lost the illusion that her authority would go unquestioned forever. I still think about Stella's decision not to walk down that aisle. How many people do you think replayed that moment later and thought about a time they wished they had done the same? And how many do you think told themselves they would have handled it differently until they imagined being in her place? Because it's easy to judge from a seat, much harder when the pressure is inches from your face. Time has a way of clarifying what adrenaline blurs. In the weeks after that day, the story of the Walker wedding didn't disappear. It changed shape. It traveled quietly, passed from one conversation to another, stripped of decoration each time it was told. That's usually how the truth survives. People asked me about it later. carefully, indirectly, as if saying the wrong word might reopen something sharp. Was it really that bad? Someone asked once. I paused before answering. Because bad wasn't the right word. It was revealing. Stella didn't contact me right away. When she finally did, it wasn't about rescheduling. It wasn't about refunds or logistics. It was about documentation. She wanted records, timelines, messages. She wanted clarity. Have you ever noticed how people only start asking for proof when they know they're about to be questioned? Austin called too, separately. His voice sounded different than it had before the wedding. Lower, less certain. He asked factual questions, not emotional ones, about contracts, about witnesses, about what people had seen. He didn't ask me what I thought. That also told me something. Joyce, on the other hand, became very quiet. For someone who had been so vocal, so visible, so certain of her influence, the silence was striking. When her name did come up, it was usually followed by a pause, a careful look, a change of subject. Reputations don't always collapse dramatically. Sometimes they thin out. Invitations stop coming. Conversations shorten. People remember, even when they pretend they don't. I often wonder what Joyce thought would happen that day. Did she believe the room would side with her automatically? That her role, her money, her confidence would outweigh what people saw with their own eyes? Or did she think the moment would vanish the way private moments always had before? Because that's the risk of behaving the same way in public that you've always behaved in private. You assume the same rules apply. They don't. Stella never walked down that aisle, but she did walk into a different version of her life. One where her boundaries were no longer theoretical, where people knew, without being told, that she would not absorb harm quietly to keep things moving. Austin faced a choice to tell, not the dramatic kind people like to imagine, but the slower, heavier kind, the kind that plays out over holidays, phone calls, and long pauses at family gatherings. Some choices don't announce themselves, they reveal themselves over time. And then there were the guests. The ones who had seen it happen. They became part of the story, whether they wanted to or not. Witnesses don't get erased easily. They remember details, tone, body language, silence. I've learned that weddings don't just mark beginnings, they expose patterns. And once a pattern is exposed publicly, it rarely goes back to being invisible. So I'll ask you this. If you had been sitting in that room, watching a mother lose control in front of everyone, would you have believed it was a one-time mistake? Or would you have wondered how many times it had happened before, when no one was watching? And if you were Stella, standing there with every reason to keep going, and every reason to stop, what would you have done? That question lingers longer than any ceremony ever could. There's a reason that wedding stayed with me longer than most. Not because of the slap itself. As shocking as it was, I've learned that single moments are rarely the whole story. They're just the point where something private finally becomes visible enough that it can't be denied anymore. I've planned hundreds of weddings. Different families, different venues, different budgets. And yet, certain patterns repeat with almost unsettling consistency. They always start small. A suggestion that isn't really a suggestion. Help that comes with conditions, money that quietly shifts from generosity into leverage. Most people don't notice it at first. Or they notice it and tell themselves it's temporary. That it's just stress, just nerves, just someone who means well. Have you ever looked back on a moment and realized the warning signs were already there? You just didn't know what they were pointing toward yet. That's what I think about when I remember Stella, because the slap didn't come out of nowhere. It came at the exact moment Joyce realized she was losing control in front of witnesses. When the usual tools, money, pressure, timing, reputation stopped working. That's often when people reveal who they are, not when they're winning, when they're cornered. I've seen families spend years repairing the damage from moments like that. And I've seen others never speak the same way again, even when they stay in each other's lives. The rupture doesn't always look dramatic afterward. Sometimes it just shows up as distance, as formality, as silence where familiarity used to live. People like to believe weddings are about love, but in my experience, they're also about power, about who gets to decide, about whose comfort matters more when everything is on display. Joyce lost control that day, but what she really lost was something she probably didn't even realize she was. Relying on the assumption that everyone would look away. They didn't, and once people see something like that, they don't unsee it. I've wondered whether Joyce ever replayed that moment in her mind, telling herself that if Stella had just stayed quiet, everything would have gone as planned. Or whether Stella ever questioned herself in the quieter moments afterward, wondering how close she came to walking down that aisle anyway, just to keep the peace. Because that's the question most people wrestle with after moments like this. Is peace worth the cost of silence? If you've ever been at a family event where something crossed a line and no one knew whether to intervene, you know how heavy that question can feel. And if you've ever been the one standing there, deciding whether to absorb harm or disrupt the moment entirely, you know how lonely that choice can be. That wedding never happened. But the truth did. And in the end, that's what people remember.